Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in just a minute, but before we do, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you. My name is Lisa Millette, and I'm a member of the Saki TTA webinar team, and I'll be your host today. I'd like to ask if you could all participate in this poll question. I'm about to launch it right now. Please let us know what your forensic discipline is. We would appreciate that. That's going to give Jim information that he's going to lead off his discussion with. If technical support is needed, please let us know through the chat window or by emailing sakitTA@rti.org. If you have any questions regarding today's material, please type them into the chat window and we will retain them for the Q&A session, which will be held at the end of the presentation. And Jim may pop in and answer questions as they're coming up through the chat pod, so please don't wait till the end. Go ahead and use the chat pod when you feel like you need to. We will archive this webinar within a few business days, and we will also send out an email announcement to all who have registered. And this announcement will include a PDF copy of today's presentation, and you can view all of our archived webinars under the Saki webinar tab on the Saki TTA website. So this is the webinar, Foundations for Investigation, Anatomy of a Cold Case Rape, and this is part 2 to part 1 that was presented in November of 2020. Our presenter today is Jim Markey, and he is a senior law enforcement specialist in the investigative science program at RTI International, and he provides direct consultation and training and technical assistance for 64 sexual assault kit initiative grantees nationwide. Mr. Markey served 30 years with the Phoenix, Arizona Police Department, rising from patrolman to supervisor. For 14 years, he led the Adult Sex Crime Unit, the first detective unit to work on a multidisciplinary team. The team comprised at least 10 investigators and investigated more than 7,000 sexual assaults, including over 100 serial rape cases. Mr. Markey's work included regular meetings with internal and external partners to develop policy and openly communicate on a variety of issues involving violence against women. He received more than 30 commendations, including the Police Chiefs Unit Award and the Distinguished Service Award. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to our presenter, Jim.
Thanks, Lisa, so much for that rousing introduction. I really appreciate the support that RTI has given for these webinars. Chris Williams and Cameron, both of you behind the scenes kind of, driving this bus, and I really appreciate that support. I'm looking at the poll. Hopefully everybody can see that. So we have about almost half investigators. We have some sane researcher, advocate. Great. We have a really good mix, and really the point of this part 2 of Foundations of Investigations for Sexual Assault Response is apparently part 1. The presenter was talking too long and went over time, so this part could not be attached to that. So what we're attempting to do is kind of shore up that, but I think it's a great way to put our knowledge into practice. So that's what the point of this part 2 of these foundations is going to do. So when we look at what we learned previously, and okay, there we go. So I just want to review some of the things we talked about in the previous presentation last November. And hopefully some of these practices are areas that we're going to apply today when we look at this investigation and kind of break it down and discuss different areas, concerns, thoughts, investigative strategies that you may have that might not have been thought of during the time of these investigations. I can tell you I'm not the expert that are out there. I've got some experience. I've done a few of these cases. I've overseen a unit, but really there's folks like you that are on this webinar that have experienced, investigated, completed things that I've probably not done. And that experience, I think, is going to help us as we walk through this part of, or this presentation. And we're going to make this as interactive as you said. Lisa said she said there'll be poll questions, there'll be chat box. Hopefully we can get to everything that we possibly can in the chat box. And I realized that we had several hundred folks sign up for this particular webinar. I realize there's a lot of power outages across the country, so I'm not quite sure what the final total is. But coming from Arizona, I really appreciate the 70-degree weather we're going to have. And if you're in Texas, I feel sorry for what you're going through, but we'll power through this. So looking at the review of the foundations from last November, these are just, from our discussion and from the guide that RTI put out under the SACI TTA project, really some fundamental things to think about. And when we talk about or think about um, this presentation today, apply or look at applying what we learned and what we understand about these investigations to what we're going to do today. And hopefully we'll stop, we'll pause, we'll be able to discuss some of these areas as we move through the presentation. So, one of the things to think about when we're looking at these cases is that investigative timeline. And I realize, let's be realistic. Time is and management is really a key to how we are able to work through a lot of these cases. If you're jammed up with new cases coming in all the time or cold cases that are flowing in now from your crime lab and from other areas, it's very difficult to set aside some time to really start doing some of these. So we're talking about the gold standard. We're setting the bar pretty high for what we believe are the best practices or the best ways to approach these cases and the tools, the skills that are in place or that need to be in place in order to be effective in resolving these cases. So creating a timeline, right? So we want to look at the case over a period of time. So we look at the original incident, and the response that was completed. We'll talk about that in the case review that we're going to do. What activity was completed? What sort of victimology was produced? And then, if the case, how the case was disposed of initially, and if it went cold, if there was unsubmitted evidence, what brought it back to life. So now we look at the cold case review and how we would look at that case. Now, based on what was done before, we want to bring in our lab and what activity there was, what sort of follow-up, what sort of approaches and strategies we want to look at completing. And of course, the key to these sexual assault cases, these cold and current cases, is victim engagement, right? What does that look like? And we also want to consider suspect contact. When we start these cases, ultimately the coup de grace for the case is to being able to sit down with that offender at some point and getting some sort of information or some sort of interview with them after all this work you've done in this case. And then, of course, what's the final status? What are we going to do? Who's our other partners with the prosecution that we're going to bring in? So you're going to hear this a lot, these analytical techniques, these structured analytical techniques when you look at it. So when we get information on these cases, whether it's a new case or an old case, you have to evaluate that. And sometimes we tend to just take the information face value and we're not maybe curious enough to dig deeper into that. So evaluate your information sources and the quality of that information. What assumptions do we have? What positions do we take in this case? What are some conclusions that maybe were previously drawn that may be not accurate, or at the time they appeared to be associated with that case, but maybe over time those have changed, and what judgments maybe were made? So we need to kind of check our assumptions at the door when we're trying to review some of these cases and some of these old cases. And then you have to have a team. You have to brainstorm. I don't know if you've ever been looking at a case and you're kind of in that writer's rut, right? You're kind of stuck, and you ask somebody from the outside or other folks, hey, look at this. And they generate these ideas that you hadn't thought about. And so I think that's really important, why the MDT approach to a lot of these cases is really critical. I think it's important to have a devil's advocate and a red team analysis, right? So I always had somebody in our briefings when we were going through cases that always, I thought they were just a negative person. Well, that's not going to work. Did you think about this? And, it gets annoying after a while. And I always tell them, just be quiet and sit there. And then later on, like maybe a few hours later, I go, that was a good point that person made. I'm glad they brought that up. And maybe we should look at that and reassess that. So don't poo-poo or don't bat down somebody that's a devil's advocate that's asking questions or questioning things, because it may bring information or may develop something in your mind um, that changes your approach to the case. And react and think like the offender. This is very difficult to do, right? Most of us are not hardwired like some of these sex offenders, where and how they operate and how they think. I think that's one of the most difficult things. I always try to put myself in a position of what would the offender do? What are they thinking about? And it's very difficult because their pattern of behavior and their thought process is unique to them, and it's stored in their brain. And I don't know of anybody that can actually jump into somebody else's brain and thought pattern and understand that. But it is important. So what we see are the remnants of what they're thinking and how they're acting, right? So we see the crime scene, we see the interaction with the victim, we see the relationship maybe they had if it's a known offender with the victim. So we pick off those cues to try to understand the offender more. And that really helps us in the end when we're looking to do an interview. So investigative considerations. So there are investigative based considerations and there's research and analysis based. And that's support that you need to be effective in these cases. I would ask somebody in the chat box if they recognize either one of those figures. And if you want to type in there that you know who those are, that would be great. And we'll get back to that later. Um, I might be dating myself, at least on the upper figure there. The lower one, you can clearly see that's from a few centuries ago. Um, but yes, Colombo, one of the great interviewers of all times. And the older photo is from a gentleman by Occam, was William of Occam, and his um, claim to fame is Occam's razor. If anybody's familiar with that, basically it's an assessment that when all other theories are disposed of, the most logical or likely theory is the one that will prevail. So he described that as slicing away these other theories that people might have until you get to that theory that's probably the most simple and the most likely. And you probably experience this when other detectives or people come in and say, I know what happened in that case. Here's what you need to do. Here's my theory on it. And you're going, okay, I understand that. And maybe you look at some of the information, but usually the simplest explanation is probably the most likely. Now, this is just a little kind of, I guess, the warning about some of the pictures. They're not really, I wouldn't consider them graphic in my opinion, but they are crime scene pictures. So just you're aware that we do show some of these pictures during the course of this presentation. Here's probably the most disturbing picture that you're going to see. It's interesting. I was actually standing out at a crime scene when we looked up and saw this coming towards us. If you're familiar with some of the monsoon behavior, the weather behavior in Arizona, this is what it may look like rolling towards the downtown Phoenix area. I'm sure some of you had similar experiences with snow or rain or tornadoes, so you understand that can be disturbing as well. When we go through the case study, it's really interesting. This is part of this presentation was given at the Detroit Summit many, many years ago when Detroit, Cleveland, and Memphis were part of the Holy Trinity when it came to cold case investigations. And part of this was presented. And the one case is you never know what you're going to see or what you're going to find or what you're going to experience. But all of these were part of this investigative file. And I know some of them are actual investigation and some are like, really? International intrigue? How did that play into this? How is cell phone technology used? What about paying your phone bill? What do you know and what information can you gather from that? And we'll talk about all these things. And when we get to the end, you'll go, wow, I can't believe that all these things occurred. There was a ruse, there's paranoia, surveillance, lab rivalry. I mean, it was really quite the pay pay for view television movie on one of the history channels, I think. So let's get into the case. Um, so this goes back a few years, but I still say that the fundamentals and the foundations of investigating cases, yeah, we have some new technology, we have some new things, but the foundation and fundamentals of investigating these cases remain the same. You could do a sexual assault investigation in Tokyo, in Paris, in New York, in Wichita, or in Phoenix, and the fundamentals of those cases are going to be the same. And that includes victim behavior, suspect behavior, and targeting. All those things are very, very similar. So if you get the foundations down and you understand the other approaches and strategies and technology that's out there, um, that is even a greater way to try to resolve some of these cases. And even though these go back a few years, some of the things that you'll see and talk about, and we'll talk about, you'll understand that, hey, that's really similar to a case that I'm either working now or I've worked in the past. It's interesting when you go to these trainings. I used to process some of these case studies and think about cases I had and how I could apply some of this information to those cases. And again, this is the gold standard of how we would expect or how we want these cases to be investigated, the technology and the resources that we could provide for these cases, not always available, but we're going to talk and teach to that highest level that, hey, this is what we hope to. Keep in mind that in Phoenix, during the course of these investigations, we just come out of two major sexual assault uh, serial cases. One was the AM rapist, and one was the baseline killer who started out doing sexual assaults and then ended up murdering 8 people as a result of this sexual propensity that he had. And so we average about 600 adult sexual assault rape cases a year. So we're a very busy unit, and this is just jammed into the middle of it. And so I think the key is identifying these cases and what resources you have available to try to work these. So this first case in July, and pay attention to some of these details because they may be important later on. Patrol spawns about 1 a.m. The victim calls 911 and says she had been sexually assaulted in her home. She is a student home from school. Her parents were not were away. They were out of town. She had had some friends over that night. They had just left the house. So I know you're starting to process, okay, so there was maybe a party going on or something happening that maybe one of the friends was perhaps a suspect. So, patrol secures the scene. They do a really good job ensuring that it's protected from, any contamination. So the threshold assessment that they do and that we do is there's no forced entry, nothing seems to be missing. There was no dog alert. We'll talk about that. There were no there were signs of a struggle and a disturbance, but not in conjunction with the information we had developed from the interview of the victim. So at the time that we're doing this crime scene, we're also doing a detective investigator interview with the victim um, at um, at our headquarters where she had agreed to come down and speak with an investigator at the time. Um, so we bring out our crime scene unit. We're looking for any pieces of evidence that might assist us in, identifying, who may have been involved in this. And interesting enough, and this may come back in later on, the suspect did not say a word the entire time that this incident was occurring. So think about that from an investigative standpoint. So here's the front of the house, typical neighborhood. It was an older, more established, near the downtown area neighborhood, but it was, pretty crime free. Just some minor incidents that occurred that you would typically see in a neighborhood. Here's an overview of it so you can kind of see where it sits. There is a school to the left-hand side of that picture. And it's very nondescript. It's near the end of the block, but it's just the second house in. When we start to look at the actual house and cover and concealment that we talk about in law enforcement, so there were, plants that somebody could potentially hide and do surveillance or observe from, or if they're leaving, that they could use these as cover in their exit if somebody's on foot. So that's just kind of the outside area of this particular scene, and you're going to see this a lot in in this presentation. We're going to talk about our key assumptions and how we come to along with those assumptions. I notice there's at least probably a couple analysts that are on this call, and hopefully we can hear from you, and this resonates with how you do your work. So we always want to ask ourselves, what do we know? So right, so what information do we have that has been validated, verified? What don't we know? So what are we looking to try to do with this information, to try to discover? What areas do we need to explore? And then that would be, what do we do next? Right. So what are our next moves, approaches, and really, to have the time to sit down and analyze this, you can do it fairly quickly if you have a small team, if you have analysts as part of your working team or your unit, other investigators that maybe to get their input. So these are some areas that you're going to see during the course of this presentation that we're going to talk about. So let's look more inside the house. So we identified one of the rooms where we were able to locate on the floor a condom still inside the wrapper, but notice on the outside of the wrapper what appear to be some sort of striations, some sort of marks, some sort of punctures. Um, you may start to create assumptions about how those were made, who may made them. I think the first assumption would be, if you've worked these cases for a while, that the offender was trying to open the condom, so he put it in I'm assuming his mouth. Let's go with that because that's the description we were receiving, and tried to tear it. What we did learn through the interview is this particular room is not the room where the assault occurred. This is the survivor's brother's bedroom. So there was no assaultive activity here. So the question would be, how did this condom get into this room? Was the suspect in this room prior to? We don't know at this point. We can assume and have some theories about that. But then as we started to do more of the crime scene investigation, it was pretty clear to us who this offender might be, who may have been involved with the transporting of that condom and condom wrapper to another room, and the puncture marks on it. And so this was our suspect. What had happened was, this was a very old family pet and never really barked. There was no dog alert, but it was in the house the entire time that this incident was occurring, on a couch in one of the other rooms. When patrol got there, in fact, when we got there after patrol secured the scene, the one thing they didn't tell us was there was a dog still in the house, but it was still laying on the couch. When we went in, it was like, oh my gosh, it never alerted to us. So one of the theories we had is, at some point between when the assault occurred and when the officers showed up, the dog had potentially located this condom wrapper and moved it from one room to the other and had chewed on it. We didn't do the DNA to verify this, but this was one of the explanations that we potentially used. So this was where the victim described the incident occurred. This was her bedroom. That door right there leads to, I'll show you the pictures next, leads to an exit out of the house through sort of a family room, and then an exit to the backyard of the house. So during the course of this assault, the victim attempted to exit through that door. the suspect grabbed her and was able to pull her back onto this bed area. And you can see, I don't have a close up, but her underwear that she describes that she was wearing is located on the floor next to the bed. So we presume this was what we'll call the primary assault scene that we were able to identify. And so just outside that door on the right-hand side, you'll see where this leads directly to a patio door into the backyard. The victim describes the suspect as exiting that door and then walking across his tile floor. You'll see a bunch of markers. I'm presuming that everybody is familiar with what sort of processing could be done on tile or wood or any hard surfaces. If you want to throw that into the chat box that you're familiar with this processing, let me know. The picture on the left is where the victim had come out of brushing her teeth in a bathroom, and the suspect confronted her in this hallway. The suspect had his shirt pulled up over his head, concealing his identity. So there was really difficult for her to get a look at the suspect's face. And again, there was no conversation between the victim and the suspect anytime during this assault, prior to or afterwards. We could find no signs of forced entry or forced exit at this scene. And so, one of the presumptions was that maybe one of the doors was left unlocked. So that's an interesting conversation. I would be very careful with how you may approach that to ask the victim about that. I've seen media releases where they've talked about, using preventative measures so you don't get assaulted, and you've got to lock your windows and your doors. And the presumption would be that maybe they didn't. And I know there could be a lot of self-blaming at that point, that why didn't I lock the door? Rethinking your actions as a survivor, as a victim, as, oh, I should have done X, I should have done Y. Did I contribute to what happened? I know I've done that. When I've left my garage door open, it's like, oh, I can't believe why would I do that? You beat yourself up over a garage door and somebody comes in and steals something, right? And so be very careful, when you don't see forced entry and you want to try to determine if maybe somebody else may have had a key, or how entry may have been into that particular crime scene. So checking the quality information. So we're talking about that, doing that review. So we have the victim statement. We have witnesses, right? Potential witnesses. Those folks were at the party. I say party. We couldn't determine that. Those folks were over at the scene prior to the assault occurring, friends of the victims. There was a rape kit that was completed. The victim volunteered and was willing to see a forensic nurse. That kit was ultimately submitted to the crime lab. So remember, this was July. So what are the evidence options? Are there latent prints from the point of entry? If you could determine that. We know we have the condom wrapper. Is there potential to get DNA if it was actually in our first suspect's mouth and being chewed on? Could that have contaminated any information? So what I was looking for was the shoe impressions off the tile, which is a technique called EDPL, electrostatic dust print lifter. It's a really interesting process. I don't know how common it is now, but we used to use it all the time. The theory was the suspect didn't float into this scene. They had to walk back and forth across potential surfaces where you could actually pull up a shoe impression. We use it in several cases, even on outside cases where we never identified the offender's shoes, but we were able to link cases together without DNA based on the shoe impression. So something to think about. The quality of information from Fluffy the dog. We were unable to find an interpreter to do any sort of interview with them, and right away, he lawyered up, so it was very difficult to get information from the dog. And then, are there other other things that we didn't think about defensively as we process this scene, that if we do identify a suspect and this gets charged, what are some areas that the defense might try to chip away at? So here we go again. What do we know? What still do we not know? And so what are our next steps? And so thinking about those three questions, let's go into the chat box. What actions or additional actions do you, right off the top of your head, that you would want to do in this particular case? And remember, this is a fresh sexual assault that just occurred, and you are in the first 48 hours of that case. Um, think about some actions, and if you want to go into the chat box, canvassing the neighborhood, absolutely. Video cameras, neighborhood cameras, um, perhaps his eyes weren't covered, just the lower half. Check for cameras. Stefan, James, Jim Root. How you doing, Jim, in Kentucky? Uh, doorbell ring. If you could expand on that a little bit, Jim. Don't know what doorbell. Oh, the ring technology. I don't think they invented that yet. Your generation Xers and Yers are familiar with that, but that's baby boomers. Verify friends that were previously in their relationships. Could this be somebody that she knew? The timing, you're absolutely right. The timing was interesting on when the friends had left, and within a half hour, the suspect was in the house. So how did the suspect know that? Was there some surveillance going on? Anything else? Yeah, the fencing, geofencing, cell towers. Uh, it's interesting you bring that up because we're going to talk about that later on. Traffic cams, yes, those were being used. What are we looking for? Somebody running through a traffic cam or a vehicle, right? So you're assessing that information. How valuable? How much time? What resources do we want to put into that? School cameras, absolutely. Schools. This particular school had security 24/7. Were there security folks there that maybe driving down the street and saw some guy running up the street? Crazy things. 911 calls, doing calls for service, right? Data mining that information, um, looking at previous break-ins, burglaries, thefts, suspicious persons, any sort of calls for service or reports that were taken. Absolutely. Illegally parked cars. You're talking about the son of Sam, right? And traffic parking ticket. Excellent. Yeah, very good, really good information. Thank you. And hopefully, we did not take all those actions, I can tell you, but that's some great information. So two keys, thinking about research-based actions, right? So let's go back in the chat box. When you think about research, when you think about analysis, what are some research-based activities? I think you've talked about some. Good point, Michelle, about victims, smells, sounds, experiential senses with the offender. That was interesting since there was no conversation, but there was alcohol that she could smell, that she detected. What are some research-based actions or activity that you could employ with this? And I think some were touched on in the initial chat. I'm looking for my analysts, perhaps, that are there on the call to give us some idea. Analysis from the victim's phone. How do we know the victim's? I think it didn't mention the victim's phone. How do we know? Oh, you're assuming that the victim had a cell phone and that we can look at information off that cell phone. Very interesting approach that when we're talking about victims of sexual assault and we're asking to do an analysis on their cell phone, I think part of the message is we want to verify the information you're telling us, that you were home, that you weren't out, that there may be text messages or direct messages that may be implicating, was there a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend involved? Very delicate, very interesting though. How do we approach that? How about a crime chart for the neighborhood? You're right. Break-ins and entries, suspicious person. I am hoping that our investigators have access or have somebody that has access to this data and information. What about sharing this? And you're within the first 48 hours, but sharing this information with jurisdictions or agencies outside of yours? Would that be something you'd want to think about? Do other cities or jurisdictions think about it, have similar rates where somebody broke in the middle of the night? The chance probably is yes. And then you start breaking those down. Could those have information in those cases that may help resolve your case? Create a crime bulletin. Absolutely. We're going to talk about that. Do offline searches. Absolutely. Um, FIs, field interrogation cards, suspicious person cards where patrol might have been in the area and contacted somebody. Absolutely. Great research based to start develop, maybe a new approach or how you're going to look at this case. The other thing is, how do you manage this information? I'm hoping that we're documenting all these steps that we're taking, that we have some sort of a system, whether our RMS systems are not great, but how those systems can help support this information, uh, and making sure it's documented. Because if the case doesn't get resolved, somebody maybe 5 or 10 years down the road is going to pick this case up and they're going to say, what the heck did these folks do in this process? So even if you're an analyst, I want to see some sort of a report, some sort of things that you looked at, areas that you researched, information you developed. I remember one case that was involving a series of apartment complexes. We went and got resident lists for these apartment complexes. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but then what do you do with a half-inch thick report of all the residents that live at these apartment complexes in the last 2 years? How do you go through that information and start to identify patterns or trends or names or information? It's got to be, sometimes it just sits there, right? But you've collected that evidence, and I guess the fear is, what if the suspect's listed in there and we didn't do the proper analysis? But having that information, if it's hard copy paperwork, what are you going to do with that? Should you create a file and then, if you don't solve it, impound all that information? I think that's one of the options that you could look at. Jim, document timelines, absolutely. Mirroring prior relationships with the victim. Yeah, again, that's a conversation that could be with survivors, that could be very delicate to have. But I think we need to, with our curious minds, identify, is this possibly again somebody that she knew? So we're going to kind of change. We're going to bring in a relief picture. We're going to kind of change where we're going with this. So some new information gets developed, right? So July it occurred. So in October 2009, the crime lab is able to identify spermatozoa on a vaginal swab. They upload it into CODIS, and guess what? They tell us right away that there's a case-to-case match to a 2007 rape in Phoenix, right? So within our jurisdiction. The first thing I did was panic. Like, oh my gosh, what did we do in 2007? Or what should have we done? And then my next thought was, what if we had a suspect identified in that 2007? So there was a lot of things rushing through my head as we're doing the scrubbing bubbles thing, where we're running around like chickens, right? So next thing you want to do is do a poll. So you have this information. I can tell you what we did, right? Ran around like chickens. What would your first actions be? So think about that and look at these options that we have. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer, but what are you immediately thinking about in this scenario for us? We'll give you a few minutes. Lisa, thank you so much for bringing that poll up and working us through this. I'm reading Sharon's comment prior to, could someone be from the party who waited and hid until the others left? Absolutely a possibility. Yeah. Hopefully we'd be able to vet that out in the investigation. So, um, or we still have people, Lisa, people that are answering in?
It does look like folks are still putting their answers in. We'll give
Okay.
everybody 20 seconds or so to get those answers in.
I think unfortunately, at least correct me if I'm wrong, you can only give one answer. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So think about the fundamentals that we talked about in November, all you folks that were on the call then that wrote all those dynamic notes. All right, so here we go. Um, thank you for not closing the case. We appreciate that. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think obtaining the second case file is definitely a step that you want to take. Would it be your first? Well, um, I don't know. Contacting the original investigator, that definitely has to be on your checklist of things we need to do. Um, review secondary evidence in either one of those cases. Yeah, I think that's something that has to be on your checklist. What about contacting the victim in these cases? Um, I think that has to be on your checklist. I would personally want to have a little bit more uh, background information about the first case. So that might be talking to the original investigator if they're available, looking at that case file, what sort of documentation, what was done on that case. And so what we're going to do, right? See if I can get my thing to advance. So let's pretend that we pulled the case file and we start to do a case file review. July of 2007, 1 a.m. I don't know if you're paying attention to the first case, but does that sound like a similar month and even a time? I don't know if there's a connection with that. Um, an investigator, those that you're from the Valley know Don Newcomer, he said there's no such thing as a coincidence. There's always a purpose and a meaning behind it. So this particular case, as we review the file, the victim is asleep on the couch, woke up to somebody on top of her. The suspect commits the assault and flees. Nothing is stolen. The victim had been drinking during the night with her fiance, who lives with her, believes the house was locked up prior to the assault. The suspect did not say anything during the course of the assault. The suspect had a shirt pulled up over their head. Um, I said the boyfriend, but it's actually the fiance was asleep in the garage, aka the man cave. So now you have some new information. So what do we know, right, about this? This was again somebody that the victim did not identify, did not know who it was, um, and was not familiar with this suspect at all. So we're going to call it a stranger. So if you look at both these cases, the first assessment would be so they're both stranger cases, stranger files. So we're going to go to another poll. So now you know both of these cases, basic information from them. Um, what actions would you consider after you do your case file review? And again, we have a case-to-case DNA hit, but we don't have anything in the database that tells us who that is, who those are associated with. Um, what does that tell you potentially about the offender? So look at is it Darwin, Hudson, and Lynn? Same MO, yeah. But think about a lot of the cases that you investigate. Very similar MO to this. So what's distinguishable about this particular? What are some of the quote signatures that this offender, this suspect, might have been? We might see it at both of these scenes. And I think there's a lot of similarities. If you didn't have the DNA, would you be able to say that I think these cases are linked, or there's a potential for cases? Not speaking straight over the head; those are unique. I can tell you that we've had cases not associated with this that were linked. And remember, these are 2 years apart. So were there any cases in between these 2 years? Where was this offender? Are there cases in between that we may have missed, either in our jurisdiction or outside our jurisdiction? So Lisa, are there still votes being taken?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
Give everybody just a couple more seconds to get their answer in.
Okay. Well, we got, thank you for that, Lisa. Review all documents in the case file. I think that's a good start. Even what's not in the case file, if you have work product notes, I don't know what folks do with those, but we've seen names and phone numbers scratched on manila folders. But yeah, do you have other pieces of evidence? Were there uh, interviews that were conducted but not documented, or interviews that weren't completed in that first case? Is there other evidence? Is there other um, laboratory analysis that was completed or started and not completed? So yeah. What about secondary evidence? And I'm talking about, we have DNA. It's probative because both of them are from the same kit. But are there latent fingerprints that maybe this individual doesn't have DNA on file, but through APHIS or IAPHIS, he may have prints on file? Nobody wanted to advise their police chiefs. Shame on you. But you certainly don't want to surprise your police chief that they see this in the newspaper. Just kidding, but that's something. Advising your chain of command, talking about what resources you may need to kind of further this investigation. When we go through these two cases, we'll tell you about the resources that we were involved in. I think a lot of these are things to think about, right? As you start to go through both of these cases, both of these files. So this is just kind of a recap. So what are some of the investigation case um, based actions that we're thinking about, right? Reviewing both the case files. Maybe you're making a little spreadsheet. Okay, what's similar about these cases? What's dissimilar about these cases? Maybe you want to start a matrix, right? So you have an actual Word document that talks about the association with these cases. And then if other cases develop, you can add those to this series of cases, because I'm assuming you'll want to go back and look for similar type cases that you may have missed. Do a codicit review. How probative is it? Um, double check. I always like to do this. How often is this profile searched? Back then, I think it was once a week it gets automatically searched. I think now it's twice a week, even maybe more. What sort of follow-up was completed? What did they do? What could have been done? What could have been missed? Not in a position where you're trying to attack the initial investigation, because there's a lot of factors that may have come into play. But hey, what can we go back and look at again? Is there additional evidence? We talked about secondary evidence. Maybe reviewing statements and reviewing those interviews again with the people that were at the first party. Is there an association with any of those people with geographically with the second location? And then how do we go back perhaps 2 years later and re-engage that initial survivor, that initial victim from the 2007 case? All things to think about that we should be considering in these cases. So let's talk about this second case, right? So let's look at some of it. So, typical middle class neighborhood, single family dwelling. Um, when we look at these pictures of where the house is located, um, what sticks out in your mind when you look at this picture? What are some things uh, that maybe are associated or similar to the first scene? For this particular, I'll point out that Phoenix has a series of canals. That's how we get our water to the valley. There's several major canals that run through the entire valley from east to west and run through Phoenix. This house in particular sat on one of those main canals, which are really active areas for running, jogging, biking, and various sex offense. we get a lot of indecent exposures, public sexual indecencies that are occurring. Is that an avenue to try to explore? You could also, we'll look at some more pictures. You can also stand on the canal and look into most of those backyards. So from a surveillance standpoint, is that something that perhaps was involved in this case? This is that cold case, the 2007 case interview. I'm gonna play it. It's about three. I think we have time. It's about 3 minutes long. If you just like we did back in the 50s, if you pony up to the radio and listen really close, you can hear the information that's being discussed between the detective and the victim, and hopefully we'll be able to hear that.
Your thing, and I haven't been to your house yet or nothing like that, so you kind of have to be able to explain a few things to me.
There's a couple of things that I thought up to since this has happened. It's a Friday night. Me and my fiance had a couple of beers. We were swimming in our pool. We had ordered a pizza. I had eaten, and he was in the garage finishing up watching a program. I finished up eating my pizza. I had closed the Arcadia door. I fell asleep. I started watching television after I got eating my pizza. I fell asleep laying down on the couch, and I woke up to somebody having sex with me, and I just assumed that it was my fiance. I mean, it's not a common occurrence. But I was still in the middle of sleep. And the more that I started waking up, I think really what woke me up was I was like trying to turn around and see him, or I was trying to kiss him or something, and then he kept pushing my head into the pillow, and that just is not something that's normal, and the whole experience just wasn't feeling right. It just wasn't. I thought it was because I was still sleeping. Maybe I was, groggy or whatever. And when I tried, like, forcibly to try and turn around, is when this person, like, jumped over the coffee table, and my couch is along this wall. There's a love seat right here, the coffee table's right here, and then there's a door that goes out into my kitchen, and there's an Arcadia door that leads out into the patio and where the pool is and everything. And by the time that I got up and realized that something was wrong and that this wasn't my fiance, he was already through the Arcadia door. The only thing that I saw was he was wearing a white wife beater and jean pants, and all I could see, he either had a crew cut or a shaved head. I only saw the back of him, and didn't see his face.
Okay, and did you see his shoes by chance?
No, I didn't.
You don't remember if he had tennis shoes or work shoes or not that?
I couldn't say for sure.
And after he came out, went through the patio door, went out in the patio, how long did you see him?
I didn't.
So, hopefully everybody heard that. I'm curious if you want to put in the chat box, what are some interesting things that you heard? Does that change your view of this older investigation? Are there some questions out of curiosity that you might have about this? We know it's connected 2 years later to another rape. Is there a connection between the two survivors? But let's walk through the scene. This is the couch that she describes. There's the coffee table. What are some of the challenges, and I think I asked this question later on, that you may have with the defense team? I think the picture we have in our mind is these sexual assaults are violent acts, and yet when you look at this, it's just like nothing occurred, nothing's knocked over, nothing's disturbed. You know, we look at the purse, nothing missing, the purse is right there. Burglary, robbery wasn't, we believe, wasn't a motive. So this is strictly a sexually motivated assault, you would assume. Here's the trash can. We had a few beers, you know, that's a question. You know, is that something the defense is going to bring up? Perhaps. You know, as we learned later on, that a lot of these were they recycled. So these were not all drank in one night. I see in the chat box, Stephen, about the pizza. It's so interesting because everybody said it's the pizza guy. It's the pizza guy. And so, you know, of course, that's an avenue that you definitely want to explore. So this is looking from the canal area back towards the back of the house. You see the open door there. And then you see the Arcadia door. The presumption was that he entered through that open door first. And what's interesting about that, so this is looking from that door back to the back area where the canal is, right above the fence line. This is the door from the inside that we believe entry is made. Here's the man cave, and I don't know in your mind if you're thinking this fiance was there the whole time. And did we interview the fiance? What did he say? Did he hear anything? The suspect apparently walked right by the fiance. Did the fiance's DNA match the DNA taken from the kit that matched this other case? Is he a potential serial rapist? I mean, so there's a lot of questions that were running through our mind. His DNA, you know, we went back and got his DNA, did not match, so we were able to eliminate him. He did not hear anything. And part of her statement was it wasn't unusual for her to be woken up and to have consensual sex with her fiance. And so that was her first kind of reaction, other than the shock now that starts to set in after she gets woken up. So there's your Arcadia door. We believe that the suspect left. Looking through the entire house, not just the scene, there was a cup on a counter in one of the bedrooms that could not be accounted for by either the fiance or the victim. That's where a latent print was lifted off of, that we were able to process. And of course, we see the television is on. And so we were really curious about that television and what was on. And so please, in the chat box, if you know which episode of Star Trek that is from, please tell us so we can eliminate that as any potential lead in this case. So we'll give you a couple minutes to check Captain Kirk. Yes, it's an old one. Don't be afraid if you're a Trekkie to go ahead and talk about this. We won't shame you. I presume everybody, Lisa, is everybody muted, I presume, or if anybody wants to actually tell us that.
All guests are muted to help mitigate with background noise.
Okay, so we'll stick with the chat box. Yeah, because I don't know, and so we were never able to answer that question. So if we ever to go to court, that was going to be definitely something the defense might attack us with. So now assessing and information management is still a key. So documenting information we know, documenting actions we complete. Um, so I kind of talked a little bit about, if we want to go back into the chat box. So now we've listened to and observed the victim's statement, the victim's emotional state at the time, and she was interviewed relatively quickly after, I'm talking 2007, the DNA link. She was interviewed shortly after that occurred, so within several hours of that assault, and that's the one with the pool and the fiance. But there was information in her statement as an investigator that was curious about in the chat box. What information about this particular case in 2007 might present future challenges and concerns that a defense attorney might bring up in the case? If you have any thoughts. ETOH consumption. Michelle, I don't know what ETOH is. Oh, okay. Alcohol. Okay. Thank you for that interpretation. Yeah, right. So the victim got really drunk, and her boyfriend, that the fiance doesn't know about, came over, and this is just a cover ploy that it was some stranger. They had a key. That's why there's no forced entry. Absolutely, alcohol. Yeah, that's probably the number one thing that that concerns both us, and definitely that the defense tries to exploit. Right. Anything else? Any other concerns um, that you saw or heard? Just a few minutes. Boyfriend not alerted, right? Why didn't the victim scream when she realized it wasn't her boyfriend, fiance? He didn't hear anything. He didn't hear anybody, see anybody walk by him. Um, you know, yeah, the identification, Michelle, back to lack of physical injury. Absolutely, Michelle. All of those uh, beliefs of what a sexual assault should be. And yeah, I mean, that's interesting, Jim, about tonic immobility. Could we bring an expert into play and kind of talk about that first freeze that she experienced when this individual approached her or was on top of her when she woke up? Absolutely. So thinking about that, but not in Kentucky. Okay. Well, okay, so let's move forward a little bit, right? So let's look at these two cases. So one in 2009, the first case we discussed, where the individuals had left, is 7 miles from the 2007 case. And I love to look at these visuals because it starts to make me think critically about how, other than DNA, how did this offender identify and assault victims 7 miles away, 2 years apart? What's the connection? What links these cases besides DNA? Because DNA is not going to solve our case. We could sit back and wait for another case to occur, and then maybe someone gets arrested and it links to this. But right now, it's not solving our case. So, if you have an analyst that can put these reports together, and you can see down in the lower part, this basically describes the incident and occurrence, and over time, if you have more cases linked. So what are some questions we have? What are the observations we get? What are some theories we start to develop with this? And I'm curious from you, and I see it in the chat box already, so you're one step ahead. What does this map tell you? What are some possibilities? Right, so job, environmental issues. What about the two neighborhoods that might be similar? What about parolees? Do we have a halfway house, perhaps, right, where they're being paroled in that area, including offenders? Good job, Lisa. Yeah, those are some great observations. And are those areas that we want to explore further? Absolutely, I think. I think those are critical. So what's some key case information? Oops. Come on, bear with me. Right? So we know we have recorded interviews of both the victims. If you're not doing that as a process, I would highly recommend that that's done, because now we had the opportunity to go back to 2007 and say, did we miss something, which we may have. We were very fortunate. The original scene was processed. Detectives actually came out to the scene. I remember responding on that in 2007. I didn't remember in 2009, but I remember once it refreshed that we went out there. So we actually, did the best we could, hammered away at. We did an area canvas. I know that somebody mentioned a canvas of the areas, or re-canvas. Witnesses were interviewed that were identified, so we had some pretty good documentation. We did have scene exams in both. There was secondary evidence. We did have the latent print. Assessing the quality of all this information, we were very fortunate. We just couldn't solve the 2007 case. DNA never came along in those 2 years to link to an offender. But now we had something maybe we felt we could move forward with this other case. So, again, we're going to check our key assumptions and our facts. And we talk about linking cases through DNA, or how are we going to solve these cases, because DNA is not going to give us that information that we need. So we look at no signs of forced entry or a struggle. What does this tell us as investigators? Did the suspect know both of these victims somehow? There were no sound heard by witnesses. None of the folks that were at the 2009, where they had left, friends of the victims, were able to give us any valuable information. We were able to pretty much clear them all of involvement. Nothing's missing. One of the defense is going to look, well, neither one of these victims appeared to be traumatized, distraught, upset. During the course of it, they were very calm. They were able to give great information. Suspect didn't speak. We do have the DNA match. We have a usable print, but we couldn't, unfortunately, link it to anything. So, again, we go back. What are things we know? What are things we don't know? And you may want to start creating a spreadsheet. What are some conflicts and consistencies or inconsistencies that we may have to address? Is there a way to do a red team or a devil's advocate? What do we do next? Right, with this? I mean, do we just sit back and wait? I hope not. But the idea with linking cases, if you solve one, you're going to solve both. If you solve one, you're going to solve multiple cases if you have the DNA to show it, right? So what are some things that you may do, or that you're thinking about, that could generate information for you? And we'll get the poll question up here in a second. So as an investigator with your agency, what are some things that you would be thinking about that you would want to try to generate more information to revive these cases? Are we having, is the poll? Lisa, did I misspeak? Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. I never know. So think about some of these. And I know there's more. And if you want to use the chat box to add, that's great. We'll give you just a few minutes. I'm looking back at the chat box. Suspect had been in both victims' homes prior. That's happened, absolutely. That might be a good question for the survivors. Did you believe anybody else could have been in your house prior to? Does Arizona search against its own database? I don't know which database, Derek. Are you talking about ELDIS, like the local DNA database, or Estes? Like the RMSs. That's good. If RMS systems are the same, then agencies can do that, but we in Arizona do not have an investigative database like VICAP that links. We tried that several years ago. It failed. to get off the ground. But gosh, I wish we had that. That's a great point, Derek. I'm glad you brought that up. So think about that for future, what we want to do in the future for investigations. How to generate additional victim re-engagement and interview. Also into VICAP. Yeah, yep. Media release with perhaps with or without a composite. Now think about the composite aspect. I don't know if those of you that have used this, but both of the victims were not able to give great descriptions. But what's the interesting thing about a lot of the survivors is they want to help as much as they can. And the first survivor believed that, actually the second one in 2009, believed that she could do a composite. And so we're going to talk about that. So, victim engagement, re-interview, near area canvas, conduct additional DNA testing, complete a composite. This was our composite that we did. I mean, it's pretty generic, but if it can generate information for the case, and you don't get too many misleads, like information that's going to send you in the wrong direction. Immediate release, we'll talk a little bit about that, enter into VICAP. So, kind of talked about that. Is there a public safety issue? And this is a question comes up a lot, because what is your agency doing to prevent this individual from attacking again? And granted, it's been 2 years, but we know that this person is still active. So is there a public safety issue that why didn't you tell the public? Why didn't you alert people that this was going on? And I know it's a decision that gets very dicey at times, that you don't want to show all your hands, all your investigative information, but how can you do that and still, I guess, fulfill your obligation as a public safety agency to protect individuals? If we had an apartment complex and there was 2 assaults occurring, you would probably warn folks in that apartment complex, right? You would go and say, it looks like it's addressing this area. We need to tell you this is what we know, without giving all the details away. If you do a canvas in an area, what does that look like? When you knock on a door and you ask somebody, have you seen anything suspicious? They're going to ask you questions like, what do you mean? What kind of suspicious things are you talking about? So you need to have a plan when you do an area canvas. As a lead investigator, you need to have information that you hold back, but you need to give individuals enough information that they can assist you with what you're looking for to perhaps move the case forward. So are there other concerns? All these things you're thinking about. So this was one of the media alerts that we sent out. I mean, we struggled over what information do we provide? What do we hold back? What's going to be some crackpot calling in and said, oh, I know so-and-so matches that description and this is the information. So maybe this is information you wouldn't have put out necessarily. And you carefully want to craft this information in these statements. So let's look back at these cases. So let's do a review of the 2009, I call it the second victim statement. Victim indicates that her cell phone she believed had been broken. She attempted to call 911 during the assault. The suspect grabbed it and she believes snapped it in 2. So as we do the review or processing of the crime scene, we did not locate the phone. So the assumption we made was that the suspect took the phone with him. So, what do we know and what are our next actions? I'm going to move a little bit quicker because I'm looking at our time. So this is, again, part of the interview of the 2009 case where the information about the cell phone is discovered. Well, we knew.
Me lying on the bed. Okay. And I picked it up and I dialed 911 while it was under me. And I guess he noticed, and I put it up to my ear, and I don't even know if we got to the dial tone, but I just screamed, 931 West 30 Lane, please come. And By that point, he was yelling this while he was trying to grab the phone. And then he just took the phone and snapped it in half. It's like a flip. So he just bent it backwards.
Okay. Where's the phone at right now?
It should be by the bed.
Okay, what color is it?
It'd be lying on the.
Okay. So we didn't find the phone like she believed. She dialed 911. Is there a record of that 911 call? Did it actually go through? And she believed the phone was broken. If you snap a phone in half, does it still work? I mean, these are all questions that we were starting to ask. So we want to do some research, and I'll keep moving forward. We want to do some research. Uh-oh, we got somebody not on mute. It's interesting, a phone call would occur right during this part of the presentation. Thank you. So this is what we knew about her phone. We were able to get her records. We were able to start to see calls. We saw when it was stolen, and then 8 hours after the assault, there was a phone call one call that was made from the victim's phone to an unknown cell phone. We got that subscriber information. We got tower information, and we discovered it was from a Cricket line. If you remember, Cricket back then was pretty sketchy. We did research through warrants, and the subscriber information was all false. So whoever had that phone had given false information. But there was one billing location that we contacted that location, and sure enough, every month that individual would come in and pay in cash that month's cell phone bill. So we were able to get surveillance photographs from the cell phone location. And this is the individual that we were told comes in and pays that bill. And it was the time that that the cell phone worker had told us it had been in, provided us with this surveillance. So we look at the composite, we look at the picture, we go, could it be, the same person, or did somebody else borrow that person's phone? And why would a suspect on a broken phone that we believe be able to put the phone back together and make a phone call? This is baffling to us. So the detective tries to cold call the subscriber to the Cricket number and gets a voicemail from a Hispanic, all in Spanish. So we didn't know what to do with this number. We decide, let's see if we can have somebody call this number and try to engage this person in a conversation. So we developed this ruse with one of our female detectives that basically used that number to get the person who owned that phone, we didn't know if that was our suspect, to engage this woman that they had met previously at a bar, at a dance, and she'd gotten the phone number from somebody that possibly knew him, just kept it very vague. And, I'd like to set up a meeting. I'd like to meet you. And so lo and behold, the ruse, we believe that this offender on his mind was quite the Don Juan, quite the individual, and he was going to meet this woman that he couldn't remember that he'd met before. So there was a meeting set up at a restaurant called Mi Patio. We have surveillance teams in the area. They observe the possible suspect. He exits the bar, and we lose him on our surveillance team. We wanted to follow him. We didn't see a vehicle, individuals on foot, and we lose him. But at the bar, he had drank 2 beers. We were able to, undercover was able to collect those beer bottles. We're thinking prints, DNA, awesome. Puts them in a bag. They were abandoned property, puts them in an evidence bag at the bar, submits it to the lab. We get the results going. We're going to solve this case, either eliminate or include this person as a part of it. We get results back. There's no DNA. There's no latent prints that they can recover off either one of these beer bottles. Could not figure out why. Boom, that just blows up we're going to solve this case now, or we're going to be able to resolve this. It was I just don't know. I don't know if maybe there was still alcohol left in the beer bottles when they got in the bag, it washed it off. I don't know. Very disappointing. So plan B, we know that the individual's on foot. We know that that me patio is less than a quarter mile from the 2009 sexual assault, right? So it's fairly current information and it's in the geographical area. And we know that the victim's phone, when that number was used 8 hours later, pinged off a tower in that area. So we know there's some connection between this individual with the cricket phone, the me patio, and that geographic location. So we just put our, in this, again, do you have the resource to do this? We put a great surveillance team, John Jesselin and his team in the area, and said, look for this individual. We know what he looks like. We've seen him. We got photographs from surveillance. If by possible you see somebody match the description, start following them. Well, they do. They observe somebody that appears to be the same person walking in the area. They start to follow this person. What happens next? Oh my gosh, should we arrest this person? Hey, I got a confirmation. This is the same person from the patio. Can we arrest this person? Do we have enough to pick him up and question him? Pretty soon, this investigative lead starts running, literally running through the neighborhood. If you work drugs at all, when you're doing surveillance on a vehicle, they do these things called heat runs to see if anybody's following them. He made the surveillance team, even though he was on foot. And unfortunately for him, he ran through an alleyway. And we have a Phoenix City code that no person shall use an alley within the city as a thoroughfare except authorized emergency vehicles. When I heard this over the radio that they had arrested him, I was shocked. Like, why did you arrest him for? Oh, using the alley as a thoroughfare. Was that legal? Yeah, we've done it before. Doesn't mean it's legal, right? So they had him in custody. They transported him back down to the main police station. We wanted to get him identified. This is a Thursday night. So we do a criminal history check. We were able to formally identify who this person was and look at their background. During the interview, he advises the detective that he believed the cartel was chasing him. That's why he ran. This is a picture of the interview. That's the suspect. He matches his surveillance information. He's drinking a bottle of water. Another poll. Quickly, we'll do another poll and then we'll get to the end. What investigative decisions, now you have this person who's a potential lead in your case, and we're making these decisions on the fly on a Thursday night. What are you thinking you would want to do or could do at this point in your investigation? So quickly, or if we can, look at these options. We can discuss those. The results, obtain a DNA sample. Do you have enough for an official warrant or court order? Do you have enough, or do you want to ask permission to get consent? Do you think the water bottle that he's drinking that he discards in the garbage can and leaves the interview room is going to yield a profile? So we took option 3. We did not ask him or advise him he was a suspect in a sexual assault. We didn't arrest him. We wrote him some citations under Phoenix City Code. We got good photographs. We thought about, did we develop some photo lineups? Yep. We did release him. They were able to do surveillance and found a house where he had been living, or where he was currently living. So what do you do with the water bottle as we move through this? So I just want to go back to the canvassing issue. So we look at the victim's house, and when we canvassed up to that X. The suspect actually lived in that second red circle. We did not make it to his house. Would it have made a difference? Maybe we identified who were living there. We identified all these folks within sight and sound of the victim's house, and we stopped there. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. So We end up taking the bottle to the state crime lab. They said they could do a turnaround in 24 hours. So on Friday afternoon, we delivered the bottle to them. On Saturday at 9 a.m., they said it's still on the instrument, but I can tell you that we have the profile from the 2 sexual assaults, and the DNA, the initial DNA from this bottle is matching to those assaults. So whoever drank from this bottle and left their DNA is associated with the 2 DNA samples. So we thought, this is our guy, right? So we had a lot of communications back and forth with the lab. Do we have enough to make an arrest? The SWAT team arrives. The suspect calls the detective who had interviewed him on Thursday and said, the cartel are outside my house. I get a hold of the SWAT team and say, where are you guys? We're outside the suspect's house. What are you doing? We're in a van. He made you. He thinks you're the cartel. I don't want a barricade situation. We felt, talking to our prosecutor, we had enough to arrest this individual for right now. So at high noon, we, Detective Maris actually leaves the office, drives up to the suspect's house, gets out of his car and knocks on the door while the SWAT team's standing in the background. He answers the door, exits the house, gets taken into custody and arrested. Interviewed and makes admissions to the rapes. Maybe if we'd have interviewed on Thursday, he would have admitted to it. So here he is. Here's the composite. Not bad. Takes a 30-year plea. The rest of the story, when we go back to May, 2 months before the July assault in 2007, in East Phoenix, there's an attempted abduction of a neighbor. There's an arrest. There's no prosecution because the victim was, quote, uncooperative. There's some pictures of patrol actually did this entire process. There's our suspect back in 2007. There's a picture of the person that he was attempting to abduct. Here's a map. So down at the star at the bottom is where in 2007, the suspect lived. We know where he lived in 2009. That line is the route he used to ride his bike. The star at the top of the map is where he worked. So he would ride his bike on that line to the location at the top. Along that location where the A is the 2007 victim's house. So think about in July. And that's the canal. He goes, I would take the canal to work on my bike. So there's the nexus between that house on the canal, we think, and him being able to do surveillance and see at some point the victim along that route. So that answered one of our questions. So when we go back to all of these things that we talked about, they came to fruition. You know, there was all these things involved in one investigation. So what do we need to do on a review? Check your assumptions, assess your information. We committed a lot of resources that I was able to convince our command staff we needed. Work with what you know, but think outside the box. Be a gumshoe, never give up. But there's operational considerations, right? If you're a smaller organization, do we have the ability to do some of the things that we were able to do? And it wasn't perfect, right? And of course, media management, you know, what do you do with this information and giving it to the public for public safety? I will just, you know, finish up with expectations comes responsibility, right? We are considered nation's finest. I know we're under a lot of pressure, a lot of heat, reform this, reform that, but we still have basic operational function as a law enforcement agency to protect the public and the community, to arrest offenders, to investigate crimes, right? I still consider us the nation's finest, right? We are the guardians of democracy. Way back in Plato's times, we are that thin blue line, right? And think about your service, not just, I appreciate your efforts in sexual assault investigations. If you're there more than 2 years, God bless you. right? We need folks like you because we have new investigators coming in. We need that experience, that knowledge, those skill sets. But your service, right, to your community, I really believe, and to the survivors and victims of these crimes is really great and a rewarding life to think about when you look back at your experience as an officer once you get to like where we're at, where we're retired. You know, it's an act of service. You're really benefiting the greater needs of mankind. This is a public. This is actually my son's 5th grade teacher that had this on a eulogy. She had passed away, and I think about it quite often. So I know we're out of time. Are there any burning questions that that you may have had that we can quickly address? Access, I believe, Lisa, access to this file and to this. Actually, I'll turn it over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jim. If you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide so folks can see your contact information. Out of respect for everyone's time, if we do have any questions that can wait, please feel free to email Jim. And we do appreciate the information that you shared with us today, Jim. It's always wonderful having you as a presenter for our SAKI webinars. And if folks wouldn't mind just sticking around for a couple extra minutes to answer our poll questions about our webinar. This is important information that we do report back to BJA. So if y'all have just a moment to answer these questions, we'd really appreciate it. And as Jim was saying, we will archive this webinar and it will be available on the SAKI TTA website, as well as we'll send out an email which will also have a link to the presentation. And Jim, if you have any other things that you want to address before we wrap it up?
No, I was just doing the last poll question. Obviously, you know, giving myself 100%.
Yes, absolutely, 100% all the way.
No, really, and thanks, Lisa, Cameron, and Chris for the support on this. You know, the work everybody's out there doing, we really appreciate it. We hope this was helpful, and I'm available anytime. And I just want to thank everybody for sticking with us and working through this presentation. And thanks again for the RTI support team.
Thanks so much, Jim. We really appreciate you. And thank you to everybody that attended today. We hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.